Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, crisis? What crisis? Kind of depends on where you are. We're headed east to see Asia's new miracles, places like the Philippines, where there's a newfound business confidence. Also Indonesia, a chat with the trade minister about the country's own crisis back in 1997, but now the stories of low unemployment and not much debt. And the nation that lost a decade, Japan. But could it provide some lessons for the current North Atlantic financial crisis? So you get kind of where we're going here, I hope, looking beyond particularly Europe for answers, or at least some lessons to learn from some darker economic days. I say particularly Europe because that's where the most acute problems are. But don't forget, growth is still poor in the United States, the nation that triggered the financial crisis. Jobs are hard to come by and consumers and business are reluctant to spend. So what are other countries doing to succeed? Well, we're going to start somewhere which appears to be booming thanks in part to sound finances, but also an aggressive crackdown on corruption. It's the Philippines, and here are the numbers to start us off. The World Bank's predicting the economy there to grow 4% this year. Not huge, but still a lot better than many countries these days. However, more than 10% of the economy relies on foreign remittances. That is, overseas workers, places like here in the Gulf, sending money back home, which continues to make it vulnerable to the global economic cycle. And there are still issues of corruption as well. Transparency International, which tracks such things, ranked the Philippines pretty low last year, 129th out of 178 countries. But the impeachment of the former Chief Justice, Renato Corona, that has sent a message to the international community that President Aquino is serious about fighting and eradicating corruption in the Philippines. Will it help strengthen foreign investors' confidence, though? Jamila Alandoga has more.
Business is good for this classic car workshop in Manila. Over the last year, work has more than doubled. Most of it coming from foreign clients who have sent their cars to the Philippines to have them worked on. But the garage owner says overseas customers were not always so trusting.
Many times clients abroad told me that the Philippines was too unstable. They kept pulling back, so business kept changing. I could barely keep it going.
For decades, the Philippines has been one of Asia's economic underachievers. Corruption and political instability kept many investors away. But an aggressive anti-graft campaign by the government of President Aquino may be changing this perception.
Last month's impeachment of the Supreme Court Chief Justice Renato Corona for not declaring his wealth was seen here as a milestone. The Chief Justice was the highest public official to be removed from office without mass protests or military intervention. A decision the business sector has welcomed.
Finally, an impeachment process that was allowed to really prosper and continue and to conclude properly. I think what we see is a maturing really of the democratic processes in the country, which is a good signal to investors.
Foreign investment in the Philippines has risen more than 70% in the first 3 months of this year. And President Aquino believes investigating officials for corruption, including his predecessor Gloria Arroyo, is making the country a more attractive place for investors. So far, there's no sign the Eurozone crisis is having a substantial impact here. Back at the workshop, Alfred Reyes says although he is grateful for the growth in business, he'll have to wait and see if the anti-corruption cases will mean the economy continues to shift up a gear. Jamila Alindogan, Al Jazeera, Manila.
Remember, most ups are preceded by a down, and back in 1997, Asia experienced its own financial crisis. Indonesia, one of the countries at the heart of it, but look at how it's doing these days. A growth rate of 6.3% at the start of this year, down from 6.5% the previous quarter, but I don't think anyone's going to complain with strong rates like that. Unemployment in the country, it's around 6.5%, not brilliant, but still better than a lot of Northern Hemisphere countries again. And the government debt to GDP ratio, it's only at 25%. Consider Italy, which is at 120% these days, and you see the comparative strength in a place like Indonesia. Now, it is also part of the 10-country Association of East Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is hoping to form a sort of trading bloc similar to the EU by 2015. Well, considering a common currency, though, and indeed ASEAN Secretary General Surin Putsuan told us the markets are tired of Europe's attempts to rein in the crisis.
Europe has been engage in these failed attempts for so many times until Davos in January. There was the G20 summit in Cannes last November that sent out pretty good vibe that Europe could put its acts together. A firewall is being built around Italy, around Greece, around Spain. But then after a while it's unraveled. And then they put together a package later on. It went haywire again. So I think it's successive failures that the markets are beginning to have some skepticism of the ability of Europe to really put their acts together. But ASEAN is in the middle of the growth center. I mean, growth rate is rather impressive, while Europe, which has been our traditional market, and North America are going through their own business of trying to put their houses in order. We have been able to dole out our own stimulus packages, infrastructure spending, and various other investment in the future, education, various other investment in order to keep on going. And I think we're going to use this time to do that, and we keep on growing. But eventually we'll have to wait for Europe and America to revive.
But let's zero in on Indonesia again. You've seen a lot from Veronica Pedrosa in the last few weeks here on Counting the Cost, because she spoke to a lot of people at the World Economic Forum in Bangkok a few weeks ago. A number of points to watch out for in this interview with Indonesia's trade minister. First of all, we've talked about the country going through its own crisis in 1997, along with many other Asian tigers, you have to say. Also corruption, how the country is working to eradicate it, hopefully. And also the desire to export more than just raw materials. So here is Veronica's interview with Indonesia's trade minister, Gita Wirjawan.
We heard the WTO Director General Pascal Lamy talking about how protectionist measures are pushing back growth. Indonesia's been accused of taking some protectionist measures. What's your take on all this? Where does Indonesia stand?
I had a discussion with Pascal over a number of matters, and one of which is the perception that Indonesia seems to be leaning more towards policies that may seem protectionist and all that. I think what has happened is that to a large extent our policies get lost in translation. I think we have not been inconsistent in terms of our wanting to climb up the value chain. We're pretty clear-headed about this. We want to make sure that the future of Indonesia is one where we don't just export coal and palm oil. We want to be able to export stuff that has value added, which is why we are trying to promote education, which is why we're trying to give incentives to anybody that would basically build factories and all that, things that are value additive to the society. Yes, we did come out with policies such as the imposition of tax on exports of mining materials, but that is not inconsistent with the spirit of the mining law that came out, whereby by the end of 2014, as much as possible would have to be downstreamed in Indonesia.
Given the current economic situation around the world, though, who do you sell to? I mean, look at what's happening in Europe.
Right.
What's your assessment of that?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's not inconsistent, again, with our spirit of wanting to climb out the value chain. If there's a time, although it's late for Indonesia to climb up the value chain, it's probably now to invest in stuff that basically allows us to multiply the value. And that's happening. If we take a look at the exports and the imports, exports have gone up in the first quarter just by about 6.9%, vis-a-vis 27% in the same period last year. But the imports, as much as they've gone up, but more percentage in the importation of supporting materials and capital goods, which really translate to our later ability to basically export stuff that's got more value added.
How does Indonesia hedge against the possibility of, I mean, we're talking about doomsday scenarios, but people are talking about this openly, a collapse of the euro?
We're not of that opinion, not of that view, but we can certainly say we had it very difficult in 1997, 1998.
Your own financial crisis.
Correct. I mean, it was basically many Asian countries, including South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia. But we had the benefit of being told to do what we were supposed to do, and we did it pretty decisively. Unfortunately, that's not something that we're seeing in Europe. I think with regards to the austerity measures, it's one of the main variables of the equation, but surely we're cognizant of the political dynamics that will make it possible or will not make it possible in other parts of the world. But surely we want a stronger Europe sooner rather than later. It is for the benefit of everybody globally.
Let's talk a little bit more about the business environment in Indonesia, because here at this kind of networking forum that is the World Economic Forum, you've been talking about corruption, very in a bracingly honest way. So what can you do about it in your position?
I mean, there's no point hiding about it. I think the important thing is to recognize that it is a long-term proposition. Weeding out stuff like corruption, which is cancerous to any society, is a long-term game. It took Hong Kong 30 years. And I think it has a lot to do with the degree to which we're educated as a society. And that's the stuff that we're investing a lot of time and money on. We're allocating 20% of our budget on education. I think the money is going to the right places, but you won't see progress in weeks nor months. But if the question is whether or not Indonesia will be less corrupt in 5 years or 10 years, absolutely. I think it will be less corrupt. And, one of the yardsticks is really by way of the world's believing in the investment thesis in Indonesia. Investments have gone up 25 to 30% each year in the last...
But how much is it that people actually factor it in? Because it sounds like you're not buying into this idea of Indonesia or being culturally or, politically, fundamentally corrupt in inverted commas.
Our GDP today per capita is $3,500. It's much less than other developing countries or even developed economies. I think the progression has got to take time, and that's only going to be on the back of commitments to basically spend money on infrastructure, hard and soft. Again, I say the soft stuff is the education part. I think the more educated people become about what's good and what's bad, and the more we can put food on the table, in an equal way, meaning the distribution of welfare is more spread out, and it is happening. Poverty has come down to around 12%. It was near 20% some years ago. Unemployment has come down to 6 to 7%. It was double that amount some years ago. And capital formation takes place outside the island of Java in a much bigger way than it ever was. In 2009, only 18% of capital formation took place outside the island of Java. Now it's 47%. So more people are getting more capital deployment, more food is being put on the table, and people are getting jobs more than ever. I think it will go in the right direction in terms of our being able to weed out whatever that needs to be weeded out.
Thanks very much, and it's a really convincing case that you set out for Indonesia's success.
Now, Japan, famous for its lost decade of the 1990s where things just kind of fell apart. And such a familiar story too, an asset bubble, cheap credit, and then the inevitable burst which led to bad debts, a banking crisis, government bailouts, need I go on? It all amounted to 10 years of stagnation. Or did it? Consider this from Nobel laureate winning economist Paul Krugman, who recently said in an interview with the Financial Times, "What we thought was that Japan was a cautionary tale. It has turned into Japan as almost a role model. They never had as big a slump as we've had. They managed to have growing per capita income through most of what we call their lost decade." My running joke is that the group of us who were worried about Japan a dozen years ago ought to go to Tokyo and apologise to the emperor. We've done worse than they ever did. When people ask, might we become Japan, I say, I wish we could become Japan. So maybe there are some lessons to learn from Japan. One of our regular contributors to Counting the Cost, Sejiro Takeshita, is a bit of an expert on this particular subject, so we've brought him back this week to talk about it. Sejiro, the Managing Director of London-based Mizuho International, part of the Mizuho Financial Group. Sejiro, thank you for your time. Our basic theme today, as you've heard here, is lessons from Japan's recovery from its lost decade, because it is looking like certainly the likes of Greece, maybe Spain as well, are headed down that path. So tell me, number one thing, the biggest thing for you that we could learn from how Japan has picked itself up?
Well, I think saying that it recovered might be too strong a word. I think it's more like resilience or resistance against making excessive changes to the liberal governance style, which basically was extremely strong during the 90s when U.S. type of governance style was very strong and they were pressurizing the Japanese structure to change. And basically the Japanese corporates, both the manufacturing and non-manufacturing, refused to make that change. Now, there are both pros and cons to this, but the good part is, especially for manufacturing, in my opinion, is that they sustain these structures. For example, lifelong employment, the seniority system, relational contracting, all these positivities that will sustain a long-term relationship and long-term strong market share, building up the business, is what these Japanese manufacturers continue to do, regardless of pressure to make that transitional change.
Okay, so you've painted a long-term picture there, one of stability, the thing that has probably helped Japan the most. I wonder, though, about the more acute sort of problems, because, when you're in the middle of a financial crisis, you can look left, you can look right, and you can think, well, what is the best thing I can be doing here right now? One of the things I noticed with Japan was the sort of tough love that they applied to the banks back then. They got tough and they said, no, you've really got to rein things in, you've got to recapitalize, you've got to sort yourselves out. Are the likes of the US and Europe still being too soft on their banks 4 years into this crisis?
Well, I think there is a subtle difference between Japan and the rest of the world in that sense because, well, Japan is very much of a banking-led society. It's a banking-led governance. And we have a very heavy inclination toward indirect financing that's basically collateralized by land. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese stagnancy has dragged on for 2 decades. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why we're not seeing a strong comeback compared to, let's say, like 20 years ago. But that's one of the reasons why there was a need to really clarify and strengthen our banking standards. So from that point of view, I don't think it's really a simple comparative analysis that one can make with the West. It is comparing apples to oranges in many sense. But yes, you're right. I mean, definitely it does help. And certainly the firm stance of the Japanese banks, which continue to procure what we call quiet funding. In other words, funds that's natured on very much of a long-term basis, especially for these manufacturers that need long-term funds, certainly helped through, for example, like the Lehman crisis. They were able to get abundant funds, and healthiness in these banking institutions certainly helped throughout the economy, especially for the Japanese manufacturers.
Sejiro, let's look at the issue of employment or unemployment, as it were. Again, that is something in Japan which has been stagnant, but that's in a good way because it hasn't jumped and leapt about like, say the United States did, for example. It got up to, 10% there at one stage. You don't even want to talk about the likes of Greece and Spain sometimes. What has been the key, though, for these Japanese employment levels?
Well, actually, as you just noted, our unemployment levels haven't really shot up that much. And again, it goes back to your initial question. It's the basically resilience and basically resistance towards transition into the U.S. type of governance style. And one of the strong characteristics of the Japanese governance style is lifelong employment and seniority system. Now, negative flip side of it is that it basically robs away the flexibility of employment. And for that reason, it's becoming very difficult to be re-employed in Japan right now. So, yes, there's also, again, pros and cons, but I would say that one of the strong features which sustained rather relatively good employment status in Japan, is again these manufacturing sticking to these Japanese governance style, especially in means of human resource management.
Okay, let's think about some predictions, shall we? Which is always fun. Where do you think Japan is actually now headed? We saw some modest gains in GDP just about a week ago. Is there enough to start helping Japan insulate from some of the European problems?
It is going to get affected directly and indirectly. Of course, there's going to be a negative knock-on effect from a demand decline in the European zone, but the indirect effect, which is strong yen, is something that's really hindering the Japanese exporters, and it is hurting them very, very much, unfortunately. I would basically say that Japan is showing a very good resilience comeback track, as you just reported, and we are seeing a good resilience, and a lot of problems that we had, for example, problems in supply-demand situations that was truncated because of tsunami and the earthquake that we had last year, flooding in Thailand. These problems are being solved very, very quickly. However, we do have a problem with strong yen, and also another big problem that we have is energy. Right now, as we speak, we have no nuclear generators that's basically reactivating, and at this point, for example, before the tsunami, 30% of our energy were basically provided by the nuclear side. So obviously, under a situation where basically don't have any resource, this is becoming a big hindrance, especially for the Japanese exporters.
Seijiro Takeshita, always a pleasure to get your thoughts. Thank you for your time. Finally this week, something a little different to what we've been talking about so far. We're in Venezuela, actually, where, of course, President Hugo Chavez has used the country's oil wealth to help fund his socialist agenda. But as he launched his presidential re-election bid, Caracas is actually telling fellow OPEC members, stop overproduction. There's a glut of oil. There are falling global demands as well. It's all pushing crude prices lower. Teresa Bo reports now from Caracas on how falling prices could impact Chavez's economic plan.
On the top of a mountain in Caracas, this is Hugo Chávez's socialist dream. A city built for this country's poor. The plan is to build 20,000 homes to get people out of the slums. Norma Camacho says she knows that oil has played a crucial role to improve her life.
The government is using oil that is a limited resource to invest in the people that will stay here. People see the benefit of oil all the time. This place is an example. I used to live in misery and now I'm living here.
High oil prices have allowed President Hugo Chávez to fund dozens of social programs like this one to help Venezuela's most vulnerable. Many of those programs are paid for PDVSA. That's Venezuela's state oil company. The problem is that PDVSA is already in debt, and some analysts here say that if the prices of oil continue to drop, the company's situation could get even more complicated.
And government critics say that the oil sector has other problems as well. They claim corruption and mismanagement could make it hard for Venezuela to get all its oil out of the ground.
There has been little investment. There are problems in the refineries and in the oil camps. The industry requires lots of investment, and the political and economic scheme that the government has presented is not enough to finance it all like the government wants.
But not everyone agrees. Latest studies show that Venezuela has bigger reserves than even Saudi Arabia. Government supporters say that PDVSA can therefore easily go into debt to fund social projects.
The budget of PDVSA is done with the cost of production, which is $60. The price now is $100. What Venezuela is asking in OPEC is that all countries respect what was agreed. But even with overproduction and the price below $100, it's okay for us.
As presidential elections near, Hugo Chávez knows that part of his popularity lies in the millions he has distributed amongst the poor. That's why Venezuela will keep pushing OPEC. Keeping the price of oil at high levels is the only way to finance the spending that's become the emblem of what Hugo Chávez calls his socialist revolution. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week. If you want to get in touch with the show, though, 3 easy ways to do it. 2 of them are on Twitter. Either me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. Email is there as well. It's countingthecost@aljazeera.net if you're not on Twitter. Just fine. And while you're online, Counting the Cost our website, aljazeera.com/business, I should say. You can link onto the CTC page from there quite easily. All our previous episodes are up there in full for you to catch up on whenever you'd like. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.